My husband's best friend bet him I'd cry when they served me divorce papers at Christmas dinner. Women are so predictable, he laughed. I signed immediately, then handed them a wrapped present. Their faces dropped when they opened it. Do you think she'll cry when she reads them? His best friend chuckled from the living room. They didn't realize I was in the hallway holding a tray of drinks, feet frozen, breath halted, pulse roaring in my ears. Brandon's voice followed, light and smug. She'll crumble. Women always do. That was 5 days before Christmas. Before we go deeper, thank you for being here. If you believe no woman should ever feel powerless in her own home, hit subscribe. It's free and helps us reach others who need strength, not silence. Now let's keep going. But this story didn't start there, not really. The unraveling began long before they wagered on my tears. It started with laughter. Always laughter. You know I could leave you tomorrow, right? Brandon would joke at dinner parties, eyes twinkling with faux affection as he rubbed my shoulder. Everyone chuckled. So did I. But inside something shriveled, tightening like a knot behind my ribs. People didn't see the weight of those words, not how often they came or how easily. They didn't notice how I stopped wearing my red dress after he scoffed, trying too hard, aren't we? Or how I started checking his tone before I spoke in public, praying my sentence didn't shift into a monologue about my flaws. He never shouted. Never raised a hand. Brandon was smarter than that. His words were blades dipped in honey. Don't embarrass me in front of my boss. You know you're lucky I'm still here. I mean, come on, what else would you do without me? Each comment arrived with a grin, a chuckle, a clink of his whiskey glass. I'd smile back. I had learned to smile. At first I defended him to friends. He's just sarcastic, I told Jenny, my childhood best friend, after she caught one of his remarks at a barbecue. He doesn't mean it like that. She didn't look convinced. He doesn't have to mean it. You look like you're disappearing. Maybe I was. I stopped posting on social media. I started missing book club meetings. Calls from my sister went unanswered more often than not. My world became smaller, centered around Brandon's moods, his rhythms, his thresholds. He liked control. Subtle control. When my mother came to visit, he made sure to remind me how messy I'd left the kitchen. Loudly. When I forgot to pick up dry cleaning, he'd mutter under his breath, useless. Just loud enough for me to hear. Just soft enough to deny. Still, I convinced myself this was marriage. Maybe not a fairy tale, but stability. Longevity. At least he didn't cheat. At least he wasn't violent. At least. Then came the gala. We were 2 glasses of champagne into a company fundraiser when he turned to me, eyes glazed with alcohol and contempt. You're just like the rest of them, he muttered under his breath as the CEO walked by. Always wanting more. Always clinging. Needy. My mouth went dry. My face stiffened with the familiar flush of shame. I didn't ask what triggered it, I rarely did anymore. When we got home, he slammed the door and went straight for the liquor cabinet. I followed him with measured steps, poured him another drink and handed it to him with a smile I had practiced to perfection. You know, I said gently, maybe we should sign something. Just in case. You always joke about leaving. Why not make it official? He laughed. A deep, careless laugh. You really think I need a prenup to protect my fantasy football winnings? He scribbled his name on a napkin beside him. There. Go get it notarized if you're that scared. Then he passed out on the couch. He forgot about that napkin by morning. But I didn't. I had it notarized within 24 hours. Jenny helped. She didn't ask questions, just looked at me with quiet understanding and handed me a pen. I folded that document and slid it into a fireproof envelope. Stored it in the back of a filing cabinet beneath a folder labeled Tax Receipts 2020. Then I emailed a scanned copy to a private email Jenny had set up for me years ago, just in case. That night I cooked dinner like normal. I asked Brandon about his day. I laughed at his impressions of his coworkers. I cleared the dishes and wiped down the counters while he scrolled on his phone. He didn't notice the way I had started looking at him. Not with fear, not with anger, but with calculation. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in me. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But I started keeping a journal. Not the pretty kind with quotes on the cover, but a plain spiral notebook I tucked beneath my side of the mattress. In it I logged his comments. His moods. The date he came home at 1:15 a.m. reeking of perfume and tequila. I wasn't planning anything yet. Not consciously. But that night at his company's New Year kickoff party, when he told a crowd of new hires, "My wife's hobby is overspending," I didn't cry. I excused myself to the restroom, looked at my reflection and thought, he thinks I'm soft. Breakable. He wasn't wrong. I had been. But I was learning. A few months later, while folding laundry, I found a receipt in his jeans. 2 wine glasses, an expensive hotel room, and strawberries from room service. Dated Valentine's Day. We'd spent it apart. He'd claimed he was out of town for work. I didn't confront him. I scanned it, stored it, locked it. It became a quiet pattern. A private ritual. Evidence, not emotions. At dinner one evening he said, "If we ever split, you'll be crawling back. You can't even fix the Wi-Fi without me." I nodded, poured him another glass of wine and said, "That's true." I no longer believed it. There's a particular kind of silence that grows in households like ours. It's not peaceful. It's tight, like a thread pulled through too many stitches waiting to snap. Every room echoed with conversations we never had. Every smile I wore came with a side of nausea. Then one night I woke to a nightmare, his voice in my dream echoing, "You'll have nothing." I sat up, sweating, heart pounding. And something in me whispered, "That's not true anymore." I had the document. The timelines. And I had time. That was the night I stopped pretending. From that point on, I wasn't his wife. I was his shadow. Polite. Polished. Watching. Preparing. The joke he thought was harmless, the napkin he thought was a drunken whim. That was my foundation. I didn't know when. I didn't know how. But I knew one day he'd reach for the same old power play. And I'd be ready. I stood in Jenny's office, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly above us, illuminating the sharp edges of a truth I wasn't ready to speak aloud. She stared at the document I handed her, the one Brandon drunkenly signed without reading, without knowing. "Did he do this willingly?" she asked, eyebrows raised. I nodded, silent. Jenny leaned back in her chair, the leather groaning under her, then slid on her glasses and began to read. After a few long minutes, she looked up with something between pity and admiration dancing in her eyes. "It's elegant," she said, tapping the paper gently. "He gave you the knife. You're just deciding when to use it." I sat across from her, my fingers interlaced tightly in my lap. "I don't want revenge. I just want to feel safe." "You will," she said. "But let's reinforce this. Make sure it'll hold if he files first." And we did. She drafted an addendum, adding clarity where there was vagueness, ensuring that if Brandon ever tried to twist the narrative, he'd be trapped by his own arrogance. We included provisions he'd never think to contest: spousal protections, financial splits, evidence of voluntary signing. He had written his name. Dated it. In his handwriting. No coercion. No pressure. Just a smug moment turned irreversible. Jenny gave me a flash drive, a printed copy, and a look I hadn't seen from her since we were kids plotting mischief behind our school library. Except this time it wasn't mischief. It was war strategy. And we were playing the long game. "I'll hold on to a copy too," she said as I stood to leave. "Just in case." That night I returned home to Brandon watching a football game, beer in hand, socks tossed haphazardly on the living room floor. I paused at the threshold, watching him laugh at a replay, the noise from the TV bouncing off the walls like echoes from a life I no longer belonged to. "Dinner's almost ready," I said. He grunted in acknowledgement. That was the beginning of my performance. And I played the role better than I ever thought I could. I became the wife he bragged about, polished, pleasant, poised. When he made comments about my spending habits in front of friends, I laughed along. When he bragged about his promotion at his company's annual party, I kissed his cheek and toasted him with a bright smile, even though I knew he got the job because his supervisor wanted him gone from his current department. I no longer argued when he was cruel. I complimented his taste in wine, his choice of restaurants, even his new aftershave, though it smelled nothing like the one he used when we first met. He thought I was softening. What he didn't see was that I was sharpening. Brandon began to relax again, believing the fire in me had burned out. His behavior grew more careless. More entitled. He started coming home late without excuses. Left his phone face up on the counter, messages flashing briefly across the screen from numbers saved without names. I saw one from Mem. It read, "Tonight? Same hotel?" He left for the gym 10 minutes later. I opened our shared laptop, synced his phone's data to my cloud folder, and forwarded the screenshots to the private email Jenny had set up for me. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I went to the kitchen and made lasagna, his favorite. He came home to a hot meal and a warmer smile. It was the best he'd eaten all week. At a barbecue a few weeks later, his best friend Nate cornered him near the grill, beer sloshing as he gestured animatedly. "She'll fall apart if you leave her, man," he laughed. "Too dependent. You've got it made." I was standing a few feet away, carefully arranging a fruit tray. I didn't flinch then either. Instead, I placed the strawberries in a perfect spiral, one red slice at a time. Brandon joined me moments later and wrapped his arm around my waist, pressing a kiss to my cheek like he hadn't disappeared the night before without explanation. "You look beautiful today," he said. I smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart." The day after the barbecue, I started recording phone calls. Only the ones that mattered. The quiet conversations when he slipped up, said too much, laughed too hard at things no loving husband should laugh at. I labeled each file by date and stored them meticulously. I felt like a spy in my own home. But I wasn't seeking revenge. Not then. I was building a parachute. Quietly. Carefully. Because when you live in a house made of cracks, you don't wait for it to collapse. You learn where to step and when to jump. I even bought a planner and began marking days with tiny symbols. An X for his late returns, a star for suspicious charges, a dot for lies I could prove. To anyone else it looked like grocery lists and meal plans. To me it was a map. Eventually I stopped reacting at all. I became a mirror. He saw in me only what he wanted to see. A woman who had stopped resisting, who had shrunk herself to fit neatly into the narrow space he'd carved for her. And so he got bold. He started leaving cash out in the open, large withdrawals he never explained. He went on business trips with luggage full of cologne and pressed shirts he never used for Zoom calls. One day I found lipstick on a receipt. The shade was called Temptress Red. I wasn't offended. I made a note. The final confirmation came 2 weeks before Christmas. Brandon had a few drinks and fell asleep on the couch with his phone unlocked. I glanced down as a message thread flickered to life. She doesn't suspect a thing. I'll file on Christmas. Want front row seats?" Attached was a laughing emoji and a gif of a woman sobbing into a tissue. My fingers didn't tremble. My stomach didn't turn. I read the message twice, screenshot it and emailed it away. Then I deleted it from the conversation entirely. That night as I lay beside him, I stared at the ceiling and thought about candles, cranberries and carved turkey. Christmas. He was planning my downfall like a party trick. He thought I'd break. But I'd already chosen the date. The witnesses. The setting. He wasn't the only one with a performance prepared. Because he'd forgotten something critical. When you hand someone a knife, you don't get to act surprised when they learn how to wield it. The Christmas table gleamed like something out of a magazine. Perfect, curated, falsely warm. A flickering garland framed the windows, candles flickered in glass holders, and the roast turkey glistened beneath Brandon's carving knife as he grinned like the proud patriarch. He wore the sweater I bought him last year, maroon with small reindeer stitched across the chest. The irony of that, me dressing the man plotting my undoing, was not lost on me. My sister Beth passed around her famous spiced wine, cheeks flushed from both the heat and the alcohol. Brandon's parents chatted about their retirement plans. Everyone looked so content, so unaware. I moved among them like a hostess on autopilot, refilling glasses, smiling with my teeth but not my eyes. Beneath my dress, my legs trembled, not with fear but with anticipation. My heart beat a steady rhythm. Tonight. 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 Brandon caught my eye once while slicing the turkey and winked. He had a look about him. Overconfident, self-satisfied, the way he used to look before his sales pitches closed. I matched his smile with one of my own, warm and unreadable. Let him believe he'd won. Best bird yet, his dad said, chewing with gusto. Steph's perfected the recipe, Brandon added, placing the platter on the table like a trophy. She's had plenty of practice. What is this, our 7th Christmas? 8th, I corrected gently, sitting across from him. He raised his glass. Well, here's to 8 more. Or, however many we last. His voice held that cruel lilt again, the one he coded in humor to keep his jabs casual, deniable. Laughter rose around the table. I chuckled too, brushing a non-existent crumb from my napkin. As plates emptied and the buzz of wine settled into the room, I noticed Brandon's best friend, Nate, whisper something in his ear. Nate was already tipsy, eyes glassy, smirk lopsided. Brandon nodded and stood up, slowly tapping his glass with a butter knife. "All right," he said, clearing his throat. "Before dessert, I have a little something for my lovely wife." I glanced at Beth, who gave me a smile of genuine delight, expecting maybe a necklace or a handwritten note. Brandon reached into his blazer, pulled out an envelope and walked over with the smugness of a man who believed he was delivering a grand finale. "Merry Christmas, babe," he said, placing it in front of me. A quiet chuckle escaped Nate. No one else laughed. The envelope was out of place, plain white, no bow, no card. I looked at it for a moment before opening it calmly. The table hushed. My eyes scanned the first line. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Already signed. Already filed. He had even highlighted a section at the bottom like a schoolboy showing off his work. I looked up. His smile was wide. Expectant. So I smiled back. "Thank you," I said softly, almost sweetly. Pause. A flicker of confusion passed across his face. Nate shifted uncomfortably beside him. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a sleek silver pen. Clicked it. Signed the papers in one elegant stroke. Dated it. Capped the pen and handed them back. Done. I could feel Beth stare on me wide-eyed. Brandon blinked, caught off guard. "That's it?" he asked, voice too casual. "That's it," I echoed, sliding the envelope back toward him. Then, without missing a beat, I reached under the table and lifted a gold-wrapped box, placing it right between his plate and his ego. "What's this?" he asked. "Your real gift," I said. He hesitated, then tore at the wrapping, revealing a leather folder. He opened it, and the moment he read the first line, the color drained from his face. His lips moved silently for a moment, reading. Rereading. Dated. Notarized. Ironclad. The prenup he had laughed through. Signed with the same hand now clutching the edge of the table. "What is this?" Nate asked, leaning in. Brandon didn't answer. So I did. "It's the agreement Brandon signed nearly a year ago. It's been updated, reinforced, and filed." "But I filed first," Brandon said, as if that nullified reality. "Which makes it legally binding under your terms," I replied with a calm smile. "Every asset. Every clause. You gave it to me." Nate's mouth parted slightly. "Holy. You okay, man?" Beth's husband asked from across the table. Brandon didn't respond. His eyes were still glued to the document. The same eyes that once scanned spreadsheets and contracts for inconsistencies missed this one glaring clause in his own life. And then I reached into my purse again. "One last thing," I said. I placed a small square envelope on the table, thinner than the first. He stared at it as if it might explode. He opened it slowly, brows furrowed. Inside was a sonogram photo. Brandon looked at it, then at me. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice even. 8 weeks today." His expression cracked just slightly. His eyes darted around the table. For a fleeting moment he smiled, almost involuntarily. But that smile withered the moment his brain caught up to his ego. Prenup. Pregnancy. Assets. Custody. The room felt like it was tilting. The weight of everything he thought he controlled now pressing down like a slab of stone. "You planned this," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. I met his eyes, steady and cold. "You bet I'd cry." "You laughed. Called me predictable." "So no, Brandon, I planned nothing. I prepared." The silence was thick, dense with the kind of realization that doesn't crash but creeps. I took a sip of my wine. The sweetness of cinnamon clung to my lips. Brandon's mother pushed her chair back slightly, her face ashen. Beth gently reached for my hand beneath the table, her thumb brushing against mine in quiet solidarity. Nate tried to speak but ended up shaking his head and looking away. Brandon stared at the prenup like he could rewrite it with sheer will. He couldn't. I stood slowly and began clearing the dessert plates that hadn't yet been filled. My hands didn't shake. My breath remained even. "Apple pie or pecan?" I asked the table. No one answered. Brandon sat frozen, flanked by the wreckage of his illusion. And I wasn't broken. I was just getting started. Brandon sat there, shoulders stiff, mouth slightly open, as if the words he'd just said had choked him mid-thought. "You planned this." But I barely heard him anymore. He was staring at the prenup in front of him like it was some ancient curse etched into parchment. Only he'd written every line himself. The room was painfully quiet except for the subtle crackle of the fireplace behind him and the slow clink of a spoon from the kitchen. Even the ornaments on the tree seemed to stop shimmering. Then his eyes dropped to the sonogram photo still lying in his lap. He looked at it like it might vanish if he blinked. The faintest twitch passed through his jaw. "Steph," he started. But I stood straighter. "No." Just one word, calm but firm. He blinked slowly, like he was recalibrating what version of me he was speaking to. His voice cracked slightly. "You don't have to do this." "Oh, but I'm not doing anything," I replied, lifting my wine glass without looking at him. "You already did." To my right, his mother sat hunched forward, lips pressed into a tight line, the pearls around her neck trembling slightly with every shallow breath. His father had removed his glasses and was cleaning them with the edge of his napkin, though they weren't smudged. Beth's husband reached for more wine and thought better of it. Nate, still seated uncomfortably at the end of the table, scratched the back of his neck, the weight of his own smugness now collapsing onto him like a broken roof. My cousin Rachel stared at me from across the table, wide-eyed, her spoon hovering halfway between her mouth and her bowl of untouched sweet potatoes. I scanned their faces slowly, taking in every expression: disbelief, shame, confusion, awe. It was better than any monologue. Their silence was the standing ovation I never needed to ask for. Brandon leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. It was something he did when he realized he'd lost control. I'd seen it before, during arguments with his boss, while trying to talk his way out of a late credit card payment, or when a deal fell through and there was no one left to blame. He looked around as if someone might save him. I didn't. "You thought I'd beg," I said quietly. My voice didn't waver. My hands didn't tremble. "You thought I'd fall apart. You were half right." He looked at me again, eyes narrowed. I continued. "Until today." He swallowed. Loudly. That was the moment I saw fear slip in. Not the theatrical kind, no shouting, no tantrum. Just a flicker. A sliver of something real in a man who'd always seen consequences as optional. Brandon opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, his phone buzzed against the polished wood of the table. He glanced at it. Another buzz. Then a third. He picked it up slowly, unlocking it with a shaky thumb. And there was the email from Jenny. Subject line: prenup confirmation, legally binding. I watched his face twist in slow, quiet horror as he read the words. Each sentence tore a layer off his bravado. His thumb scrolled quickly. His lips parted. His skin paled. He reached the bottom, where Jenny had signed it with the firm's letterhead and her usual touch of elegance. She had even attached backup copies with metadata timestamps and everything. Ironclad. "Tell her it doesn't count," he muttered, gripping the phone like it might change. Another buzz. This time it was from his father's email app. The subject line read: "Forwarded, signed prenup, dated documents, FYI." The man he once referred to as a legal dinosaur had just received proof that his golden boy had handed over everything on a silver platter. Brandon lowered the phone like it had burned him. I turned toward Beth, who had been quietly watching everything unfold. "I could go for something sweet now," I said softly, my voice almost cheerful. "Can you pass the pie?" "Which one?" she asked, recovering quickly. "Apple. And whipped cream, please." As she began slicing into the pie, I stepped away from the table, moved to the buffet counter and retrieved a clean plate. Brandon's eyes followed me, still wide, still trying to catch up. I returned to the table and sat beside my sister, placing the pie gently in front of me. From my seat I turned to him one final time that night. "I'll have the locks changed tomorrow," I said simply. He looked like he'd been struck. Then I picked up my fork, took a bite of pie and smiled, not to provoke him, not to perform. Just because the cinnamon was warm, the crust buttery, and the taste reminded me of something I'd forgotten long ago. Peace. Brandon pushed his chair back, the legs scraping across the hardwood. "You think you've won," he said. I didn't respond. He didn't deserve a reply. He stormed out of the room, leaving the prenup, the sonogram, and the remains of his pride on the dining table. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Beth exhaled sharply beside me. "I always hated that sweater," she muttered. Laughter flickered through the room, soft, unsure at first, then growing. Rachel laughed nervously. Even Brandon's mother chuckled faintly, covering her mouth with a napkin, though she quickly looked away. I took another bite of pie and leaned into Beth. "Merry Christmas," I whispered. She rested her head briefly against my shoulder. There were no fireworks. No shouting. No overturned chairs or broken dishes. Just a quiet unraveling of power, measured in glances and documents, and a single slice of dessert. The room shifted that night. Not because I changed the dynamic, but because I reclaimed it. Beth stayed the night. After Brandon slammed the door behind him, she just looked at me and said, "You're not waking up alone tomorrow." She didn't have to say more. We slept in the guest room, me curled on my side, one hand resting on the gentle rise of my belly. Her hand brushed mine briefly in the dark, wordless and warm. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath for the past few years until that night. When I finally exhaled, it felt like someone else's breath, someone I didn't recognize. By morning, Brandon was gone. No note. No call. Just silence. I came downstairs and found the coffee pot cold, the front door locked from the inside, and his keys missing from the hook. I made myself breakfast for the first time in weeks without having to second-guess the clink of my fork or the sound of the toaster popping. By 9 a.m. I had the locksmith on the phone. "Emergency or standard change?" "Standard," I said, then paused. "But make it fast." He came that afternoon. A quiet man with kind eyes who didn't ask questions when I handed him Brandon's old keys and said, "Make sure none of these work anymore." When he left, I stood in the foyer with a new key in my hand and realized this was the first thing I'd owned alone in years. Not the house itself, not yet, but the feeling. The certainty. That evening I moved into the master bedroom. It still smelled like his cologne, faint traces of something expensive and cold. I opened every window, let the December wind run through the space, stripped the sheets and bundled them into trash bags. I found an old box of sandalwood candles in the closet, ones I used to love before he said they gave him headaches. I lit 3, set them on the dresser and watched the light shift across the walls like they were dancing just for me. The next day his mail started arriving with red stamps across the envelopes. Final notice, past due, immediate action required. I stacked them neatly on a side table near the door. I didn't forward a single one. Jenny called that evening, her voice practically bubbling. "You won't believe this," she said. "Actually, you will. Brandon's lawyer called this morning. His face must have been priceless when he realized what you've been sitting on." I smiled into the phone, curling into my blanket. "Is it official?" "He lost 70% overnight," she replied. "And with a baby on the way," she paused for dramatic effect, "he's going to be cutting a check so big he'll need a payment plan." My smile widened, not for the money, not even close, but because I could finally sit in my own living room without bracing myself for war. "I'm proud of you," Jenny added softly. That nearly broke me. "Thanks," I whispered, "for staying when I didn't even know I needed someone. You've always been strong, Steph. You just finally let yourself believe it." The fallout was quiet at first, like snow melting instead of avalanching. Some friends unfollowed me. Some chose sides. A few sent me cautious texts full of disclaimers and, "I'm not taking sides," but others were bolder. One message from a woman I hadn't spoken to in 2 years simply read, "I wish I had your strength." A bouquet of peonies arrived at my doorstep days later. No name, just a card. "About time. C. Brandon's assistant. Claire." I smiled and placed the flowers on the mantel. Of course she knew. It was only a matter of time before word spread at his office. The man who had once made jokes about training wives like interns suddenly lost his audience. His best friend Nate stopped laughing in meetings. The comments stopped. The swagger. Apparently his team noticed he'd been leaving early, muttering under his breath, ignoring deadlines. I overheard Beth's husband on the phone with someone later that week. "Nah man. He's been off. Like, haunted. Haunted. Good." The man who once said I'd be nothing without him now walked alone at lunch, forgotten in a world that once cheered for his cruelty. Me. I started buying lavender soap again. I painted the nursery soft sage green, a color he once called pointless. I hung tiny string lights around the window and placed a stuffed giraffe in the corner. I started lighting candles after dinner and drinking herbal tea in the sunroom, barefoot, unbothered. One evening I caught myself humming while folding laundry, something I hadn't done since my second anniversary. I bought new bedsheets, white with tiny gold stars, and slept diagonally across the mattress because I could. One afternoon I passed Brandon on the street. He was coming out of a bank, talking into his phone, looking irritated. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did but didn't know what to say. I kept walking. Later Jenny sent me a screenshot. Brandon's firm had removed his name from the quarterly newsletter. I replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Then I made tea and watched the wind dance through the curtains. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Not really. It was about small things. Freedom. Peace. A slow, steady rebuild of a life that belonged to me. And the quiet realization that the woman he tried to break was now the one who had rebuilt everything without him. The first time I felt her kick, I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, humming along to an old Nina Simone record while slicing peaches for a pie. It was so soft at first I thought I imagined it. A flutter like a wing brushing the inside of my belly. Then it came again. I dropped the knife. Both hands flew to my stomach and I stood there, stunned and smiling, tears catching me off guard. It wasn't just a kick. It was a reminder. A rhythm. A message. You're not alone. He was real. Growing. Strong. And so was I. That night I wrote in my journal for the first time in weeks. I kept the entry short but deliberate. This baby will never hear yelling through a door. Never feel like they're walking on glass. Never confuse fear for love. I underlined the last line twice. My world had gotten smaller, but warmer. Softer in all the right places. My cousin Elena moved into the guest room during my second trimester. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a basket of homemade lavender muffins, wearing her usual oversized hoodie and the same gold hoops she'd worn since college. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she said. "And anyway, you need someone to stop you from eating pickles and ice cream together." We fell into a rhythm almost immediately. She worked remotely from the kitchen table, wore fuzzy socks in July, and didn't ask about Brandon unless I brought him up, which I rarely did. That part of the story was no longer worth repeating. Jenny dropped by every few days with groceries and warm casseroles and baby name books with silly post-it notes inside. Page 37. Do not name her Tiffany. Not because it's a bad name, she explained once, laughing over tea. Just because I had a Tiffany in middle school who cut my hair with safety scissors during art class. We laughed more in those months than I had in years. We didn't talk about court filings or lawyers or any of the old wounds Brandon left behind. We talked about recipes, crib colors, what kind of stroller folded easiest, and whether her ex was secretly stalking her Pinterest boards. It was the first time in a long time that silence wasn't something I feared, but something I shared. The baby's room took shape slowly. I painted the walls soft yellow and filled it with thrifted furniture I refinished myself, one coat of warm paint at a time. A rocking chair arrived in a giant box, and Elena spent 3 hours trying to assemble it before throwing down the instructions and declaring, "This is your villain origin story." We laughed until our faces hurt. One quiet Sunday I pulled a box from the back of the hallway closet. I knew what it was the moment I touched it. The slight crackle of the satin ribbon, the faint scent of cedar clinging to the edges. Our wedding photos. I sat on the living room floor and opened the lid. There we were, frozen smiles and vows wrapped in white lace. His hands around my waist. My eyes full of dreams that had since burned to ash. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I slid each photo into a separate envelope and labeled the box, "To release." Then I drove to the donation center, handed it over without ceremony and walked away lighter. I stopped at a bookstore on the way home. Bought a blank journal with a leather cover and thick ivory pages. That night I titled the first page, "Plans That Are Only Mine." I wrote in it every evening. Some entries were long. Some just a single word. But every one of them belonged to me. By the time Christmas came around again, the air inside the house smelled like cinnamon and pine instead of tension. The dining table was smaller, cozier. No theatrical centerpieces. No wine glasses used as weapons of charm. There was laughter. Real laughter. The kind that bubbles up without effort. Beth brought her toddler who kept dropping mashed potatoes on the floor and yelling, "Oh," with the pride of a magician pulling off a trick. My dad carved the turkey while Elena tried and failed to make vegan gravy. Jenny brought a date, her first in a year, and I didn't feel envious. I felt full. And next to my sister's son sat a brand new high chair, white with little yellow stars, holding the love of my life. My daughter. She had his eyes maybe. But the rest? All mine. Her cheeks were full and pink from the cold. Her tiny fingers gripped the edge of her tray while she babbled nonsense like it was the most important speech ever given. I didn't spend the evening watching the door. I wasn't checking my tone. I didn't rehearse answers in my head or wonder if someone's compliment might trigger a jab. I was present. Every bite of food. Every shared glance. Every story told between courses felt like a celebration. Not of survival but of something new. After dinner, I curled into the armchair by the fireplace, my daughter asleep on my chest, her tiny breaths warming the fabric of my sweater. Everyone else had drifted to the kitchen or gone out for a late walk, but I stayed behind, holding her, surrounded by the kind of peace that used to feel fictional. I took a sip of my cocoa and whispered to her softly, "He said I'd be nothing without him." She stirred slightly, her fingers curling. I kissed her forehead and smiled. "Turns out," I murmured, "I'm everything without him." This story of calm power and perfect timing gave you chills. Hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she slid that gold-wrapped box across the table. What was your favorite moment? Tell me in the comments below. For more stories of strength, smart revenge, and emotional justice, subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment.